Hello, I'm Richard with EV4U. In this video we will discuss matching a salvaged OEM propulsion system to the vehicle you want to convert to electric. So how do you decide which donor vehicle setup to use? Cost, horsepower, torque? Is it what someone else has done? How do you know which donor vehicle setup is a good choice? There's more to the decision than just cost, horsepower, and torque. Efficiency should be the prime objective, as it will affect your range and the cost of driving. So what determines efficiency in regards to the propulsion system? Well, join me and let's find out. So what do I mean by a salvaged OEM propulsion system? Well, this can be the entire motor and differential or just the motor. So the first thing to consider is compatibility. And what do I mean by compatibility? Well, the motor and differential need to be compatible with the vehicle you're going to convert. So how do we determine if the motor and or differential are compatible to the vehicle to be converted? Well, one of the issues is size, the physical dimensions of compatibility. Will the donor setup fit in the vehicle to be converted? Duty rating. Can the motor power the vehicle without overheating? For example, you don't want to use a Fiat 500e setup in a 3/4 ton pickup conversion. Next, let's consider drive configurations. By drive configurations, I mean, is it a front motor, front wheel drive, front motor, rear wheel drive, rear motor, rear wheel drive, dual motor, all wheel drive, single motor, all wheel drive, or four wheel drive? Is it going to be a motor to a drive shaft back to a differential in the vehicle? And in some instances, you're going to need a motor to gear reduction system. And so these are all possibilities and things that need to be considered. Typically, you want to retain the same drive configuration that your vehicle to be converted had from the factory. And most people will focus on the physical, mechanical aspect of the installation. Mounting the components in the vehicle, connecting the drive wheels. That's important, of course, but what about efficiency? Isn't the objective to have an efficient EV conversion? Not just one that rolls down the road under its own power, but one that's efficient. With EVs, the measure of driving efficiency is miles per kilowatt hour. Just like with the gasoline car, it's miles per gallon. Well, with an EV, it's miles per kilowatt hour. So why care about driving efficiency? Because it affects both your range and the cost of driving. The national average is 3.1 miles per kilowatt hour. The driving efficiency of your conversion can be affected by several factors. Probably the number one factor is your driving habits. And of course, ambient temperature, the terrain, road conditions, whether it's a rough road, wet road. Believe it or not, in the rain, you have more rolling resistance than you do on smooth, dry pavement. The vehicle weight, the drag coefficient of your vehicle, and some of these factors are within your control and some are not. But the one that we want to focus on in this video is gearing. That final drive ratio of your conversion will have a direct effect on your vehicle's driving efficiency. So both the too high of a gear ratio and too low of a gear ratio will affect the driving efficiency. Like I said earlier, many people make the decision based on price and availability or horsepower, but let's take a deeper look. The following is for the sake of discussion and as an example. Let's say I want to use a Nissan Leaf motor and differential to power my 1991 VW Transporter Doka. The Leaf setup is a popular choice and it's an economical one. But is the Leaf drivetrain compatible with the Doka? Well, let's investigate. With the Leaf motor and differential physically fit? Yes, it'll physically fit. There's plenty of room in the engine bay of the Doka. Will the Leaf motor and differential be capable of powering the Doka? Well, let's look at the numbers. First, let's talk about the weight of the two vehicles. We're talking about the curb weight and the gross vehicle weight rating. Now, the motor needs to be able to move the gross vehicle weight of that vehicle. So that's the vehicle fully loaded, and you don't want, like we talked about the Fiat 500e, you don't want a electric motor setup that's not capable of moving that entire gross vehicle weight rating. Now, it might be able to move it, and that's really not the issue, moving it. The issue is being able to power it up a grade or accelerate with traffic and to perform as a normal vehicle would without overheating and having issues. So that's what we're looking at here. So the Leaf, we've got 3,500 pounds to 4,200 plus pounds, and that's because they make several different models and different battery pack sizes, and so we have a variance. The early ones weighed less than the newer ones. And then the gross vehicle weight rating is 4,872 pounds. Now the Doka has a lighter curb weight, 3,075 pounds. But it has a higher gross vehicle weight rating because it's a pickup. It's designed for a payload, much more payload than the Leaf, which is a passenger car. So the payload is 2,204 pounds. And so you can see the difference here between the gross vehicle weight rating is 419 pounds. Now, if this was a passenger car, this would be an issue. But because of the type of vehicle that the Doka is, it's really not an issue because I can, control that payload. And so instead of taking, 2,200 pounds, I'll take 419 pounds less and not have an issue. And that still gives me, a pretty good, over 1,500 pound payload. So you can see what we have so far is workable. So far so good. The Leaf setup will physically fit in the vehicle and the weight ratings are close enough. But what about gearing? And why will gearing matter? Well, it's because the Doka and the Leaf have physical characteristics that don't match up. The two main issues are the drag coefficient and the tire sizes. The drag coefficient for the Leaf is a 0.28 and the drag coefficient for the Doka is a 0.48. So the lower the number, the better. The lower the number, the less the drag. And so the Leaf has a lot less drag than the Doka. And that drag at speeds above 45 miles an hour mean greater resistance moving down the road for that vehicle. And so the motor needs to overcome that. And so tire size, aerodynamic drag, these things are going to affect that final gear ratio is really important. So let's take a look at the tire size. Like I said, the tire size affects your final drive ratio. So the Nissan Leaf has a couple different tire sizes that they use based on the trim model. So the base S trim uses a 205/55 16-inch rim, whereas the SV and SL trims run a 215/50 R17 17-inch rim. And the Doka, like I said, this is 1991. It's an old car. 205/70 R14, 14-inch rim, much larger, profile. That's quite a bit lower profile than a 70. So a little bit of difference in the radius of the tires and the circumference of the tires, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So like I said, the difference in the wheel diameter affects that final drive ratio. So how do we calculate the most efficient gear ratio for our EV conversion? Well, to start, we want to match the motor's peak efficiency RPM range to the desired cruising speed. And typically, we're talking about the Nissan Leaf here, but typically donor vehicles will feature a single gear reduction and 7-to-1 to 10.1 or 10-to-1. So a little bit of range right there, and you'll see that the Leaf falls kind of in the middle there. We want to keep the motor in its high efficiency RPM range while producing sufficient torque for acceleration. And so the basic formula that we're going to use is the gear ratio equals the motor RPM divided by the wheel RPM. And I'm going to show you how we are going to calculate the wheel RPM as well as the motor RPM. So first I'm going to show you how to calculate the wheel RPM. So we're going to do this a couple different ways. First off, we want to calculate the rotational speed of the wheels, or the wheel RPM, at the target maximum speed. And so we need to know the tire circumference or the radius to do this. Well, the formula we're going to use is going to be using the wheel circumference. So I've written the formula for figuring that. So wheel RPM is going to be the speed in miles per hour times 63,360 divided by the wheel circumference in inches times 60. So we're going to run those on these and see what what our outcome is. So some of the information base information that we want to use is centered around the Leaf itself. So we want to know what the Leaf's motor's maximum RPM limit is. We want to know what is that target efficiency range of RPMs that they're going to have set for like freeway driving. And so those things, fortunately, we can get off the internet. So what do we know about the Nissan Leaf? Well, at typical highway speeds, 65 to 70 miles an hour, a Nissan Leaf motor rotates roughly 7,000 to 8,000 RPMs. And the maximum RPM for the Leaf motor is approximately 10,500 RPMs. And the top speed is roughly 90 to 95 miles an hour. I'm sorry this video is a little bit choppy. I'll see what I can do in the editing, but we're in the middle of a thunderstorm, and so it gets kind of loud once in a while, and I have to cut. Anyway, so the Leaf uses a single speed gear reduction, and it's usually 8.2 to 1. So that's the gear ratio we're going to use for some of our calculations. And just to give you, again, some benchmarks, the Nissan Leaf generally achieves between 3 and 4.5 miles per kilowatt hour, depending on the model year, the battery size, and of course driving conditions and the driver. Real world mixed driving for the 40 kilowatt and the kilowatt hour and the 62 kilowatt hour models is typically 3.5 to 4 miles per kilowatt hour. And so if you were to use a Leaf setup, you can kind of see how you fare next to the stock vehicle setup. Anyway, we talked about the sizes of the Nissan Leaf tires. So I came up with a nominal size based on the range there, and that's what we're going to use for our calculations. And so for the Nissan Leaf, that's 12.4 inches. Okay, and that was the radius. We're not going to use that in our calculation, but for a comparative. And so tires on the Doka, it has a 12.65. So 12.65 inch radius. So you can see, even though different sized tires, higher, sidewall profile, smaller rim, lower sidewall profile, but larger rim, the radiuses don't come off that far, which is going to be nice. But again, we're going to have to do the math here. So how do we calculate that optimum gear ratio? Well, I've given you the formula. Let's crank some of the numbers. I mentioned the Leaf's maximum speed and motor RPMs at different speeds. Well, let's take a look at the Doka real quick. The Doka is low geared from the factory. I mean, if you consider the stock transaxle, mine had a 2.1 fuel injected water boxer engine, 4-speed gearbox, and I don't know the final drive ratio, but I can tell you it's low geared. And at 75 miles an hour, you're doing a little over 4,000 RPMs. So they're not really the most freeway comfortable vehicle. That thing's spinning up pretty good going down the freeway. So for the sake of discussion, in the example here, we're going to figure that the maximum speed of the Doka is 85 miles per hour. Now, the Leaf on the internet was listed between 90 and 95 as the maximum speed. I think, having driven the thing, I've only been maybe 75 in the thing. I think 85 miles an hour in a Doka is about most people's comfort level maximum. It's just not going to feel that comfortable at those speeds, especially since there's nothing in front of you either. So anyway, that's what we're going to use for our maximum speed. And so we want to make sure that we want to see where the motor RPM range is at the maximum speed of our conversion. And then we'll also take a look at what the motor RPMs are at that freeway cruising speed, 65 to 70. So that's where we're going next. So we're going to figure out the wheel RPMs first, like I mentioned, and then we can plug that in to the gear ratio. Well, I'm having so many interruptions, I'm losing my train of thought. So let me try this again. So the wheel RPM is going to be based on that 85 miles an hour top speed we talked about times the 63,360. And that equals a large number. And that large number is going to be 5,385,600. And we're going to divide that by the wheel circumference times 60. And the wheel circumference is 79.5 inches times 60. And that equals 4,770. And so we're going to take this one, divide it by the 4770, and this is going to give us the wheel RPM of 1,129 RPMs. That's the wheel. Okay. So that's half the formula. We now have the wheel RPM. And so the wheel RPM is 1,129 RPM. And the motor RPM, we said the maximum 10,000 500. We're just going to go with 10,000. So we're going to take 10,000 RPMs on the motor, divide that by the wheel RPM, and that's going to give us the gear ratio. And the gear ratio is going to be 8.9 to 1. That would be the gear ratio that we could go with this Doka. But we remember the Leaf comes with a 8.2. So let's see how that, pencils out. Whether or not that's going to be a big issue, this 8.9 to 8.2. It sounds like it could be. But let's run the numbers. So let's run the numbers using the Nissan Leaf gear ratio. And so we're going to modify the formula a little bit here to be able to do that. We're going to take the gear ratio of 8.2. We're going to multiply that times the wheel RPM of 1,129. And that'll give us the motor RPM of 9,258. And that's at the 85 miles per hour, because that's what we plugged in here. So at our maximum intended speed for our conversion of 85 miles an hour, we're still well below the 10,000 or 10,500 RPM. So in that aspect, the Doka is okay. We're still looking good. We're still looking like the Leaf drivetrain setup is going to work. But let's take a look at what it would be at typical highway speeds, 65 to 70 miles an hour. And like I said, the Leaf, we know, it's designed from the factory. It's running between 7,000 and 8,000 RPMs at that speed. Well, let's see where it lines up with our Doka setup. So we're going to calculate it for 70 miles an hour. And so the wheel circumference, not going to change. What's changing is our speed right here. So it's going to be 70 in this calculation. So this number will change. And let me do that math. Oh, I've got it here already. So it turns out that that's 4,435,200. So we're going to take that, 4,435,200, divide it by the 4,770 we had from before, and that's going to give us our wheel RPM, and in this case, that's 930 RPMs. And then we're going to take the 930 RPMs and the gear ratio that are known, and so it's just going to be like last time, 8.2 times the 930, and it's going to equal 7626. Get this out of my way here. So 7,626 at 70 miles per hour. Now, remember the Leaf was between 7,000 and 8,000 from the factory. We don't look too bad. So it looks to me that using the stock Leaf stock Nissan Leaf motor and differential in the Doka is pretty much, you know, a good fit, RPM wise. Okay, all this seems to match up pretty good. So what do you know so far? It'll physically fit, that the Leaf motor and differential will fit in the Doka volumetrically. The weight differences aren't enough to be an issue. The tire size doesn't seem to be an issue. So I'm thinking we've got a really good match here. So what you're going to do, you've determined that it's a good match on paper. That's when you start buying the parts and start going to town. Do the homework first before you spend any money. But once the conversion is completed, you can run, you know, your efficiency tests just by driving and keeping track of your consumption, and you'll find out exactly how well you're doing. And if it's doing well and matches the stock Leaf figures, or is really close, you may say, you know, call it good, call it a day. But depending on where you fall in there, you may want to make some slight adjustments. And you can make slight adjustments, since in this case I think it'll be fairly slight, but the big thing is the, you know, around town the vehicle's lighter and everything, so you're probably going to do good around town. It's going to be speeds over 45 miles an hour, freeway speeds, when you have that drag coefficient come into play. And that's when you may want a little bit different gearing. And subtle changes like that can be had by changing the tire. So by changing the profile of the tire, or depending on how drastic you need to go, I mean, there's room in the Doka to go to a 15-inch rim even. But anyway, I don't think it's going to be that drastic, but definitely, you know, gives you an idea of the big picture aspect of making these decisions. Do your homework, find out what the donor vehicle's specs are, know the specs on the vehicle that's going to be converted, and then you can run the numbers and lay things out and realize whether or not you're making a good decision or not. And remember, in this aspect, it's you know, it's about the economy of the car. You know, is it going to be an efficient vehicle to operate? And so what I use the Doka for is stuff within 40 miles. And so there's times I take it on the freeway, and there's a lot of times when I'm going shorter distances, I take surface streets. Because the Doka at 50 miles an hour and under doesn't do too bad. When I'm doing 65 and 70, you can tell the thing's a pig when it comes to aerodynamics, because the old consumption rate goes way up when we're running down the freeway. And so, you know, in the big picture, the Doka will never be as efficient as the Nissan Leaf, you know, was. But we want to get it the best it can be. But I can tell you, firsthand experience, that the you know, even though it's not the most efficient vehicle rolling down the road, it's a great vehicle as far as its versatility, and it's a lot of fun to own and drive. And so I enjoy mine, and whatever vehicle you choose to convert, I hope you enjoy it also. Hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching. Really appreciate it if you'd like and subscribe.